Good evening, and welcome to our second event exploring big data at the margins. I'm Luke Stark, and I'll be tonight's moderator. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. And along with my FIMS colleagues on the Big Data at the Margins Organizing Committee, I'd like to thank you for being co-present with us tonight. We know that the virtual is grounded in materiality, embodiment, and place. The place from which I'm speaking to you and the lands on which Western University is located are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Arawandran peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Many of you will likely be on different territories across Turtle Island and beyond, and I invite you to offer your own acknowledgements of the traditional Indigenous caretakers of the lands on which you're currently located in the chat on Zoom. I ask us to show respect for the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to these lands as their original caretakers, and to acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, including the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, endure in Canada and in other settler colonial territories. Recognizing these painful histories of genocide and forced removal, I ask us to honor the Indigenous communities still living on and connected to these lands and circulating vibrantly on online spaces. We can do so by striving for restorative justice for Indigenous peoples and for those who have been oppressed and pushed to the margins. This event series, Big Data at the Margins, is dedicated to exploring the impacts, pitfalls, and opportunities afforded by the use of AI and big data on and by groups who are economically, socially, and geographically on the margins, who might live in smaller towns and cities, and or be members of socially or economically marginalized groups within those communities. Drawing inspiration from its immediate context of London, Ontario, a small city in a seemingly quiet corner of the province, the series examines the various ways digital media, big data, and artificial intelligence affect the daily lives of those who are economically, socially, or geographically marginalized. Critically, our aim is also to highlight how marginalized communities can and are fashioning their own strategies and tactics for resisting hegemonic digital power and reclaiming, in the words of one of our panelists for tonight, Tawana Petty, their own data bodies. And tonight, the second event in our Big Data at the Margin series focuses on how the digitization and datafication of the criminal justice system has intersected with the development and deployment of AI-driven technologies like facial recognition and predictive policing algorithms. Police forces in Canada, including here in London, have been eager to use facial recognition to identify and arrest, raising major concerns surrounding data privacy and the civil rights of the accused. Civil society activists, ranging from the water protectors of Standing Rock to the Black Lives Matter activists of this past summer's uprisings against police brutality in the carceral state, have been similarly targeted for FRT surveillance by law enforcement authorities. Algorithms used in the US criminal justice system to predict recidivism have drawn international condemnation for their potential for bias against Black defendants. And in a different register, the work of activist scholars like Timnit Gebru, Meg Mitchell, and others on the Google AI ethics team has been subverted and Gebru and Mitchell fired for calling out the racist and sexist biases embedded in AI technologies. This intensification of policing of and with digital tools has been met by stiff resistance by communities across North America and beyond. And calls are now circulating not only for many of these technologies to be banned, but also for a broader dismantling of the irredeemably racist carceral state. Tonight, guided by our three expert speakers, I'd like us to consider collectively together how we can best come together to push back on the deployment of FRTs by police forces, schools, and other civic institutions, what the best strategies are for the successful abolition of facial recognition and other carceral technologies, and how to protect our autonomy and dignity offline and on. We're grateful for the generous support from the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western Research, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which have all made this conversation and the Big Data at the Margin series possible. And before I introduce our speakers for tonight, I want to draw your attention to our upcoming third BDAM event. Taking place on March 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Lily Irani, Greg DePuter, and Lisa Nakamura will feature in a discussion on digital piecework, the new workers and geographies of the digital economy. Together, we'll examine how we can support workers in communities on the margins whose jobs and livelihoods are being threatened or transformed by developments in AI, big data, and machine learning, and how we can demand accountability from the powerful platforms that are engendering these transformations while denying the rights of their workers to fair pay and safe working conditions. I strongly encourage you to register for the event via the Big Data at the Margins website. And one final housekeeping note, if you have questions for our panelists at any time during this event, please enter them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the night. Anne Cavoukian is one of the world's leading privacy experts. She served an unprecedented 3 terms as the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada. And during her tenure, she developed Privacy by Design, a framework that seeks to proactively embed privacy into the design specifications of information technologies, network infrastructures, and business practices, thereby achieving the strongest possible protection. In 2010, international privacy regulators unanimously passed a resolution recognizing privacy by design as an international standard. Since then, the PBD framework has been translated into 39 languages. Dr. Cavoukian is presently the Distinguished Expert in Residence, leading the Privacy by Design Center of Excellence at Ryerson University in Toronto. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Ted Rogers Leadership Center at Ryerson, and a Faculty Fellow at the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Dr. Cavoukian has received numerous awards recognizing her leadership in privacy, including being named as one of the top 25 women of influence in Canada. And in 2017, Dr. Cavoukian was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for her outstanding work on creating privacy by design by the Governor General of Canada. So without further ado, Dr. Cavoukian.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's a pleasure to be here, to be speaking to you today. I'm just so delighted that these topics are being addressed because they're essential to ensure that privacy isn't eliminated and freedom obliterated. It's, I know strong words, but they come from a reality that I live in. Now, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background in terms of privacy by design. And this is something I created, as Luke said, many years ago in my first term as privacy commissioner, because I wanted, see, I'm a psychologist, that's my background. So when I became commissioner and I had all these lawyers talking about regulatory compliance, which is very important, laws to protect privacy, I wanted a different approach as well to complement that. I wanted a proactive approach so that we could ideally prevent the privacy harms from arising. A model of prevention, much like a medical model of prevention. So I remember sitting literally at my kitchen table at home over 3 nights, coming up with the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design. And the essentials of privacy by design, I'm going to be talking to you about them, and they will tie in very closely to facial recognition and the enormous problems with facial recognition. So let me start by just dispelling the myths. Privacy is not about secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. It drives me crazy when people use that expression. I always think that could have been the motto of the Stasi police in the Third Reich, because it just says, well, if you don't have any problem, what's wrong with the state having access to all your information? The problem is that that's not what freedom is about. Freedom is about you being in control of your personal information. Privacy is all about control. You deciding on the use and disclosure of your personal information, who you want to give it out to, who you want to share it with, and who you don't. I always say, look, privacy is not a religion. You want to give away your personal information? Be my guest, as long as you make the decision to disclose the information. It's absolutely critical. User control is critical, freedom of choice. And the Germans, Germany is the leading privacy and data protection country in the world. The Germans came up with a wonderful term called informational self-determination, that the individual determines the fate of his or her personal information. And I love that because, privacy is, how we say, it forms the foundation of our freedom. It's also essential for societal prosperity, well-being, because it breeds innovation and creativity. The crazy blue sky thinking, the wild ideas that come and go until you zero in on the ones you like. You have to be able to do that freely without anyone looking over your shoulder, without any concern that people may not understand or whatever before you're ready to disclose this. Surveillance is the antithesis of privacy. It's the exact opposite. It's one of the negative consequences of surveillance is that it usurps your cognitive bandwidth. And sorry, here I'm talking as a psychologist, but it makes you go inward in terms of your cognition. And it takes you away from innovation and creativity. And it's something we have to get rid of. So as I said, I created Privacy by Design in my first term as Privacy Commissioner, and we had the very good fortune of having it unanimously passed as an international standard in 2010. Privacy commissioners have an international privacy conference once a year, usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day conference, we have a half day delegated to commissioners advancing resolutions that they would like the entire assembly of commissioners and data protection authorities to vote on. And that year, I advanced the resolution that Privacy by Design should complement regulatory compliance proactively. And what amazed me was that it was unanimously passed, because most privacy commissioners are what I call lawyers, brilliant lawyers who love to zero in on Section 29, Sub 2, Part A, and apply that to the fact situation. And what amazed me, again, is that it was unanimously passed. So afterwards, I thanked my fellow commissioners. And in talking to them, I just queried why this had happened. And each one of them, they said, it's easy. We can no longer rely on regulatory compliance after the fact. And they used the example of the tip of the iceberg. We as commissioners were only reaching the tip of the iceberg in terms of privacy harms. That in this day and age of massive social media, online connectivity, everyone sharing so much information, we were only getting to the top. We weren't getting to the base of the iceberg, so to speak. And they said, we need something that complements regulatory compliance that is simply no longer sustainable in and of itself. And I was delighted with that. And we had such luck with this. Not a week goes by when I don't hear from some jurisdiction as to what they're doing. As I think it was mentioned, it's actually now been, Privacy by Design has been translated into 40 languages. And I get contacts from all over the world. And most recently, Brazil, which just introduced their new privacy legislation, which has Privacy by Design in it. Very, very exciting. So let me tell you the two essentials to Privacy by Design. I've already talked about the first one: be proactive, prevent the harms from arising, much like a medical model. The second point is banish zero-sum models. By zero-sum, I mean you can only have a positive gain in one area, security, always to the detriment of the other area, privacy, so that the two total to a sum of zero. Now, I have no problem with making great gains in security, but it sure as hell can't come at the expense of privacy. And when you have a zero-sum win-lose model, it's either or, only one can win. And that's why when I created Privacy by Design, I said we have to get rid of this dated zero-sum model. It is so yesterday. Let's get rid of it. And I said, let's change the paradigm from a zero-sum model to a positive-sum model. Positive-sum means two positive gains at the same time, win-win. And it's as simple and as difficult as getting rid of the versus, privacy versus security, to privacy and security, privacy and data utility. It's and. It works beautifully. And I'll never forget when I was in graduate school at University of Toronto, Anatole Rappaport, the creator of game theory, positive sum, zero sum, etc., was a professor. And I just fawned over him, and I just loved his teachings. And I always used to go and talk to him after class. And I remember on one occasion I said, Professor Rappaport, why do people embrace this zero-sum model? I'm the eternal optimist. I'd much rather have two positive gains, win-win, instead of win-lose. And he said, Anne, it's simple. It's the lazy man's way out, zero-sum. It's much easier just to focus on creating one success rather than two. But the long-term benefits of multiple positive sum gains are endless. So I've never forgotten that. And I've insisted upon that wherever I go. And I've bounced this off of tech people, brilliant cryptographers like Bruce Schneier. I remember Bruce Schneier, a brilliant data scientist cryptographer. He said, Anne, the zero-sum model involves unnecessary trade-offs and false dichotomies. Get rid of it, forget it. And I've never forgotten those comments. So the essentials of Privacy by Design is what I've just outlined to you. But one of the, there are 7 foundational principles. The second one is privacy as the default setting. And this one is a real game changer because it says we're going to embed privacy as the default, meaning you, customers, citizens, you don't have to ask for it. We give it to you automatically. It is embedded within our systems, and we can no longer use your personal information for any purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection that you have consented to. And you see, consent and notice are huge. I'll get to that in a moment when I talk about facial recognition, because neither of those exist in facial recognition models. And as I said, I've had great luck with this. You can go to my website. Operationalizing Privacy by Design is a paper that we've, a compilation of 22 papers we wrote with all of the leading tech companies. Think of any big company, Microsoft, Intel, HP, Oracle, IBM, of course, and I'm leaving out a number of them, because I wanted to show people this is eminently doable, and all the big companies are doing it. And I'll never forget, I got a letter from JIPDEC, the Japanese Information Processing Development Center, and it was so touching because they said, Japan's private sector has insists on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and we've become enlightened by Privacy by Design. The reason I was excited by that is that Japanese people whose first language is not English can understand the value of that, then surely the rest of us can figure this out. Privacy by Design was also included in the General Data Protection Regulation, which came into effect in 2018 in the European Union, and it was huge. The GDPR has raised privacy dramatically, returning control back to data subjects, and to my delight, it actually includes Privacy by Design and privacy as the default, which is the second of the 7 foundational principles. Now, let me switch to facial recognition. It is just so many problems with it. First of all, it's largely invisible. You don't know it's operating largely in the background. It's taking place. You have no idea it's there. And your facial image is the most sensitive personal information that exists. It deserves the strongest protection of privacy possible. And here it's being largely collected without any notice being given to individuals, certainly without consent. And there are so many problems with this. I'll talk about the facial recognition platforms that are being used in US airports and Canadian airports at kiosks. Let me distinguish one-to-many from one-to-one facial recognition. So in the Canadian airports, for example, there's facial recognition kiosks, and you can also sign up for Nexus, which allows frequent travelers to go through very quickly, and it requires your facial image. And the beauty of it is, though, it's a one-to-one comparison. So yes, you authorize them to use your facial image. It is completely with your positive consent, and it is only compared to your image as I appear at the kiosk at the airport. It compares the image it has on file to my face, not to thousands of others, and it does a one-to-one comparison. Most facial recognition is not like that. It's one-to-many, where the cameras all around in malls and everywhere you can imagine, they're collecting your image without any consent or notice, no control whatsoever. And what is so appalling about this is the unbelievable level of inaccuracy with facial recognition. Off the scale. The false positives in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, they said the false positives were at 81%. They have cameras everywhere and they use facial recognition widely. 81% of the time, it falsely identifies you as the person of interest. Outrageous. And believe it or not, in Detroit, Michigan, in the US, 96% of the times, I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read this about 6 months ago. 96% of the images captured by the police through facial recognition cameras are wrong, 96%. And you might say, why the heck is anyone using this? Which is an excellent question, because it should not be used. To me, full stop, it should not be used. And the good news is there are many states, especially in the United States, that outline, literally, that are not permitting facial recognition to take place. I was speaking in California last year before the lockdowns, and I was in San Diego, and they're locking it down. No facial recognition. California is going that way. Texas is going that way. And a number of other states are going in that direction where they're saying flat out, no use of facial recognition is permitted by law. And let me tell you something, when I was privacy commissioner, a number of victims of identity theft came to me and they said, look, we don't know how to clear our name. For example, credit card companies keep saying, we racked up all these charges and we have to pay them. And it wasn't us. We didn't do it. They've got the wrong identity. Identity theft, that was the case of identity theft in those instances. But when you get the wrong identity, your life is ruined until you can clear your name. I used to tell them, go to the police and file an occurrence report. At the very least, there's something to substantiate your claim that your identity has been stolen. And then I would work with them to help them create, clear their names and get rid of the identity theft, etc. But with facial recognition, the possibility of identity theft is enormous. And the possibility of you being identified as the bad guy by the police, law enforcement who can come after you, it's just outrageous. And then there's all these unauthorized uses in the UK, where, as I said, they've got facial recognition cameras everywhere and 81% false positives. But do you know what the majority of the police manning these cameras, what they're doing? They're following the good-looking women. I'm sorry to put it that way. That's what I've been told, that they're literally following and tracking all these babes while they have the ability to do that. I know that sounds outrageous, and it is outrageous. But these are clearly the unauthorized uses of facial recognition that are taking place to no benefit whatsoever, and the false positives that can come back to haunt you for years. I'm not kidding. It can take so long to clear your name if you're falsely identified as a person of interest. So I could go on and on about this. Let me end on a good note, though. There's a company called DID, an Israeli company, and they're amazing. What they do is they have a technology that obfuscates your facial image when facial recognition technologies try to get it. So your facial image has been picked up by a facial recognition camera. If a DID system is being used, none of the technology will be able to identify who that is from the facial image. If you and I look at my face from what DID is doing, you'd still be able to tell it's Ann Cavoukian. But the technology, people trying to track it in terms of the tech, they won't be able to do it. And I'm just going to read something to you. As more systems adopt facial recognition, the risk to privacy, of course, escalates dramatically. And all organizations that handle images, corporations, governments, huge law enforcement agencies, face new challenges involving regulatory requirements. And privacy concerns grow on a daily basis. You cannot change your face, unlike changing a password. So DID's groundbreaking technology produces images that are literally unrecognizable to facial recognition algorithms while keeping them similar to the human eye. DID's facial distortion is specifically designed to make it difficult for AI to overcome. So that's something I'd like you to take a look at. I'm going to stop now because there may be questions. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them before I have to leave early, unfortunately. But I'm here to answer any questions that may arise now. So I'll turn it back to you, Luke.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Ann. We do have one question so far in the chat, and if folks have questions for Ann Cavoukian, please do add them to the Q&A function in Zoom. So the first question is privacy by design an industrial design standard or a design principle?
That's a very good question. Privacy by design, ever since it's been included in the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, it is no longer just a principle, but it is entrenched in law. And that applies to the EU, but so many countries all around the world are upgrading their privacy laws to become essentially equivalent with the GDPR because they want to engage in trade with the EU and engage in business practices without being held back. So many countries all around the world are literally upgrading their laws to include PBD. I get contacted. I now have a consulting service that I'm offering because people have been asking me to do this like forever. So I'm now in the consulting business, and not a week goes by literally when I don't hear from some jurisdiction what they're doing about privacy by design, entrenching it in their law. How can they operationalize it? All of these kinds of things. The other thing I'm doing for businesses worldwide, is I offer Privacy by Design certification in conjunction with KPMG. Sylvia Kingsmill, the senior partner at KPMG, works with me. And the way it works is if you're a company and you're interested in showing your customers you offer the strongest privacy possible, you contact me and you say, I want to become certified for Privacy by Design. And I email you back and I say, wonderful, with your consent, I'll put KPMG in touch with you. They will come to your operations, to your office, etc., and look under the hood. Make sure your technology, your practices, whatever, are consistent with the 7 foundational principles of Privacy by Design, and they'll give me a report. And if I find that it's substantial, I'll give you Privacy by Design certification. And the reason companies love this, you wouldn't believe the number of companies that have come to me with this afterwards saying, we love this. It has built trusted business relationships where they didn't exist before. There's such a trust deficit right now, and it's growing on a daily basis. Privacy by Design, because it's recognized globally, when companies see you're doing that, they love it and they sign up right away. And it builds enormous consumer trust. Companies gain a competitive advantage by offering Privacy by Design. And I tell them when they get certified, sing it from the rooftops, put it on your website, tell your customers, etc., the lengths you're going to protect their privacy, and they will reward you. They'll reward you with their ongoing loyalty, and it will attract new opportunity. It brings in new customers. So it becomes a win-win.
I have a kind of related question actually from the chat, which is people often frame privacy and data protection as an issue of property rights and or civil rights. Presumably it's both, but how ought we to accommodate both, especially when they're in tension?
You have to cover both. You're absolutely right. Property rights are very, very important to individuals. This reflects your property. It belongs to you. You should be able to protect the data associated with it, as well as civil rights. Privacy is a fundamental human right. It forms the foundation of our freedom. Free and open societies wouldn't exist without a solid foundation of privacy. So it's both property rights and fundamental rights, and both need to be addressed, and they can both easily be addressed. I work with companies all the time. I work with government departments. It's not an either or. Remember, if you take away nothing else, get rid of the zero-sum mindset of one interest versus another. No, we do positive sum, multiple gains all the time.
We have a number of related questions about privacy and facial recognition in the time of COVID, and including around mask wearing and similar questions. And one question being, can facial recognition still recognize you if you have a mask on? But also, I guess more broadly, how is COVID affecting the kind of privacy game, I suppose, or the privacy issue, and how can Privacy by Design help with that?
The only thing I like about masks are that it, generally speaking, makes facial recognition not work very well. So I'm delighted at that. Yay. Apart from that, there's nothing I like about COVID or the lengths governments are going to make information publicly available. I'm sure you've heard about vaccine passports, travel passports, the IATA travel passport. All these things are coming through, and it is outrageous for the most part in terms of how much personal information you're expected to divulge. I've worked with one group called the Good Health Pass. You can Google them and take a look at it. They are based on just are you positive or not? Have you tested positive for COVID or not? Unfortunately, when we travel, you're going to be asked that question again and again, and you're not going to be able to travel without a negative finding. So the Good Health Pass does have a digital record of whether you've tested positive, hopefully not, of COVID. And you are allowed to show it. It's under your control. It's digital. It's entirely under your control. So when you go to the airport, you can consent to the person at the desk showing them that you're negative. And that's it. It doesn't go anywhere else. Great lengths have been taken to protect everyone's personal information in the Good Health Pass. The only information it will reveal at your wish, you are under control of this, is whether you've tested positive or negative for a COVID test. That's it. Nobody else gets the information. It doesn't go to any unauthorized third parties. And that's what we're hoping to keep it at, because who knows where this information will land. The other thing, I worked on this in Ontario with the Ontario government, and now the entire Canadian government is using it. we've developed what's called a COVID alert. It is it's an app. It's not a contact tracing app. It's called and it's based on the Apple Google framework, where it's an exposure notification app. You basically download this and it will tell you if you've been exposed to someone who is 6 feet or 2 meters who is tested positive for COVID. And then you decide how to proceed. Do you want to go to your family doctor? Do you want to go to a public health authority? And trust me, I worked with Apple. They contacted me on 2 separate occasions to walk me through the code, because they always know I always want to look under the hood, trust but verify. And they walked me through all the code. No personal information is being collected by Apple, Google, anybody. It is entirely under your control what you wish to do with it. And that's how we have to keep this. We have to preserve control.
Actually, that ties to another question from the chat, which is, how do you make sure that companies aren't fooling you when you look under the hood? What do you do to make sure that you can verify their claims?
That's a very good question. I have a relationship with Apple that I've had over the years. They do end-to-end encryption on all mobile devices. I have an iPhone that I've used for many years. And I'll admit it, I've developed trust with Apple because I've worked with them for years. And Steve Jobs, a story I love to tell about the brilliant Steve Jobs. He used to buy a new white Mercedes every 6 months, less a day, and he would take it into the shop and buy a new one, and then take that home for 6 months, less a day, and then take it into the shop. And he kept doing this until no longer. Why did he do that? Because in California at that time, you had up to 6 months before you were required to get a license plate number placed on your new car. And he didn't want a license plate number. He didn't want to be tracked, surveilled, anything. He didn't want any numbers associated with it. I loved that. Unfortunately, after he died, they changed the law and you have to get license plate number much faster. The point is, people don't like to be surveilled. And so I have developed my relationship with Apple that I do trust them when they walk me through the code and allow me to dig very deep. But it's a very good question. You always have to look under the hood, trust but verify.
Another question from the chat. If you could give, or if you know if there are, or if you could give examples of privacy by design being implemented in non-Anglosphere or non-European contexts, where there are maybe different local and cultural norms and ideas around privacy.
I can give you an example. In Canada, TELUS, one of the 3 major telcos, has had multiple privacy by design certifications, because for privacy by design, we certify a particular product or service. And they have applied for privacy by design certification, as I said, successfully on multiple occasions, because they want to assure their customers that their motto is customers first, privacy first. They walk their talk. They're amazing. And there are many other companies, I can't think of any right at the moment. I don't want to give a list, but the point is there are many companies who buy into this.
Do you have examples from Japan or China or Brazil or sort of other parts around the world where this is being applied?
There have been a number in Europe. I think 1 or 2 in Japan. As I said, I don't have my list, but yes, it's not just here. And because KPMG is international, they're able to do the certifications around the world. Brazil is getting very interested in this, as I mentioned, because it's now in their law. So stay tuned.
Maybe just one final question. So the right to be forgotten is a legal issue that's picking up steam in Europe. Basically, the idea to order tech companies to delete your digital history, for those who don't know. And the storage of facial scan data seems it will be significant. And the questioner is wondering if there are mechanisms in place that might mandate governments and private companies to delete a facial scan or facial scan data either upon request or after a certain period of time.
I would tell everyone, if you suspect that you have your facial image retained by someone, a company or a government department, file a complaint right away with the Privacy Protection Commissioner, Privacy Commissioner, or Data Protection Authority in that jurisdiction. File a complaint. Doesn't matter if they have the authority. So in the EU with the GDPR, you're golden. So always file a complaint. But I would file a complaint with the commissioner in Canada's. We have provincial commissioners. We have federal commissioners. We have people everywhere who are very interested in this. And I would file a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, for example. There are many, many interested parties who object to facial recognition and understand that it is completely, in my view, unethical and inaccurate. I mean, it's a lose-lose, if you will.
just one more question, actually, which is that asking whether you know about the kind of motivations around facial recognition in things like Snapchat and Instagram filters. Is it just a fun trend, or is our privacy being threatened? Asked the questioner. So I guess this is the kind of use of FRTs in kind of commercial applications by companies like Instagram.
I know Instagram goes to great lengths to protect the data that they have in their possession. So these companies want to do it because people want it and they want to exchange facial images, but they go to great lengths to protect the data. I'm much more worried about, as I mentioned, private sector entities in the UK and law enforcement. I am concerned about law enforcement gaining access to this data. I'm sure you've heard of Clearview AI that slurped 3.3 billion facial images from social media and elsewhere, and they're selling it to law enforcement agencies all over the world. In Canada, in Toronto, a number of months ago when this story broke, the then police commissioner here in Toronto didn't know that his staff had had a contract with Clearview AI. And that was the case in Edmonton and other jurisdictions, and they shut it down immediately. So anytime you hear about these things, raise the concerns loud and clear, because we'll get this shut down.
And the absolute last question, and then I think we're going to have to let Dr. Cavoukian go, is asking whether you've worked with Indigenous people when it comes to privacy laws and privacy by design.
You know, I have not, but I would love to. It would be an absolute pleasure to. Anyone who asks me on privacy by design, I'm there to work with them. And of course, I'd love to work with Indigenous people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cavoukian. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Cavoukian now has to leave a little early.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, so I'll now introduce our second speaker. Inalua Devaraji is a scholar, computer scientist, and activist interested in topics of algorithmic auditing and evaluation. She's currently a Mozilla Fellow, tasked by the Mozilla Foundation to develop new thinking on how to address emerging threats and challenges facing a healthy internet. She's worked closely with the Algorithmic Justice League and with its founder, Jud Bellamwini, on several award-winning projects highlighting cases of bias in computer vision. She's also collaborated with Google's ethical AI team, led by Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell, to develop a documentation framework for machine learning teams, and has been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and the AI Now Institute in New York City, at New York University, working on various projects to operationalize ethical considerations in machine learning engineering practice. Raji is also the founder and executive director of Project Include, a nonprofit initiative aimed at increasing access to engineering education in low-income and immigrant communities in the Greater Toronto Area, in partnership with the Toronto Public Library. Project Include's curriculum encourages students ages 12 to 19 to create with code despite economic barriers and to contribute their unique perspectives to the tech industry. And in 2020, she was named one of the top innovators under 35 by the MIT Tech Review. So, Deborah Raji, please tell us a little bit about your work and how you've been so influential in the criticizing facial recognition.
Thank you so much, Luke, and thanks, Anna. That was an incredible sort of overview of the situation in Canada. I ended up sort of in this space of thinking about facial recognition more from the engineering side. So I had studied engineering at the University of Toronto and got an internship at Clarify, which is a computer vision company in New York. And I found myself on this applied machine learning team, and one of a meatrative task that I was given at that time was a small company, so they quickly forgot that I was supposed to be an intern and just gave me the work of training and deploying models for them. And one of the models that I was tasked with was a facial recognition model, and actually training a facial recognition model and developing it for the company, for a client that the company was working with. And that was the first time that I had actually interacted with the data sets that we were using as a community at the time, in the computer vision community. And I noticed, the sort of sketchy ethical standards that people had to securing data, face data. So for reference, face data is as identifiable as a fingerprint. It is very sort of unique biometric information, but we don't, upload pictures of our fingerprints to the internet. We treat our faces very casually, and we disseminate that information on the internet in a way that we don't do with other biometric tools. So a lot of machine learning engineers actually exploit this. In the case of Clarify, they were, and this was later reported by the New York Times, so I'm now allowed to say this, but they were caught, scraping data from dating profiles, specifically OkCupid, and using that as data to develop their machine learning models. So one, I was noticing, the way that the sourcing of this information and the way that was happening at these companies was very questionable. But more importantly, something that struck me immediately was the fact that a lot of the faces I was looking at, even as someone on this applied machine learning team supposed to train these models, looked nothing like me. And I already knew I stood out in the industry. At that particular company, I was the only Black person and only woman and youngest person, on the engineering team. So I already knew that I stood out within, the field, but it was really shocking to me that the data sets that we were working with at the time were also incredibly biased and only really representing, one part of the population. So that was my introduction to the reality of the fact that, people that look like me would not be represented in the data sets that I was supposed to be using to train models. And I remember the reaction of my manager at the time, because I was incredibly alarmed by that, and I was trying to have a conversation with anyone about it. And my manager at the time responded with, "Well, it's so hard to get any data. You should be happy that we have data, much less thinking about, bias and all of these other issues. Like, no one cares about this." And that was actually what led me to go on the internet and try to find someone else that cared about it. And that other person was Joy Buolamwini at the MIT Media Lab, who was getting started with launching, the Algorithmic Justice League and working on the Gender Shades project. So when I went to work with Joy, one of the first things I did with Joy was support her Gender Shades project, which was a project where we had both had this similar experience. So I had the experience of sort of being in this tech company, being told to develop a facial recognition model, and understanding that the face data sets that I was looking at were incredibly skewed demographically. And she was having the experience at around the same time at MIT, where she was trying to train a facial recognition model for a project and realizing that it wasn't able to recognize her face properly. And it had prompted her to sort of launch the Gender Shades Initiative, which is an effort to assess these commercially deployed facial recognition products to see how well they actually performed on these different demographic groups. So we knew that we were worried about, how it performed on, darker skinned individuals versus lighter skinned individuals, male presenting individuals versus female presenting individuals. And that was sort of the impetus for how these different categories were conceived. And then thinking from there, okay, well, how well does this model perform on like the simplest task, which was the binary gender classification task at the time. So what Gender Shades was, given this binary gender classification task of determining if this was a male face or a female face, how well could the model perform on these different subgroups that we were worried about: the darker female subgroup, the lighter male subgroup, the lighter and the darker male subgroup, and the lighter female subgroup. And the result of that audit was that even for commercially deployed products by the biggest tech companies in the world, IBM, Face++, which is a tech, a Chinese tech company, and IBM, Microsoft, Face++, and then later on Microsoft, as well as Kairos, which is a very sort of influential startup in that space. We found that the disparity between performance on darker skinned females was large. It was an incredible performance disparity between that group and the lighter male subgroup. So that result was surprising for a couple of reasons. One, it sort of revealed that these were all deployed products. So it revealed that these companies were comfortably selling technology that did not work for a segment of the population. And at that time, we were not necessarily as aware as we are now that this is incredibly, the fact that it doesn't work for this particular group is, objectively, misleading in terms of just advertising. These were products that were claiming to be performing at 99% accuracy. But also it was actually a risk for that subgroup. So especially, and this became very clear when we audited Amazon, where Amazon at the time, ACLU had discovered the summer that we had audited Amazon, ACLU was also kind of concurrently investigating Amazon for its attempts to sell that facial recognition product, the same facial recognition product that we audited, to ICE, which, you know, immigration enforcement agency, and then also police departments, different law enforcement groups across the US. So it became clear that people were trying to sell a product to law enforcement that at the time we had just realized did not work for darker skinned individuals. And the more, you know, research we did into facial recognition and the way that it's being used by law enforcement, we realized it was sort of this you know, double risk of the fact that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't work for this particular group, but also this particular group is the group that, you know, minority neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods are where facial recognition is most widely deployed and most widely in use. Surveillance technologies are most prevalent in these minority neighborhoods. So, you know, the people that this technology is most likely to impact, it is also the least likely to work for. And it's also the situations where that false, you know, identification is most likely to escalate into something like a false arrest, which can be really disruptive to the life of those that are affected. And this became incredibly clear in the case of, you know, Robert Williams and another man in New Jersey, and, you know, ongoing cases of people realizing that, you know, false arrests that have actually been the result of this false facial recognition match. So since then, it's been an interesting journey. We've learned a lot about, you know, what it takes to push back against facial recognition. You know, one of the early sort of important consequences of our work was that the National Institute of Standards and Technology sort of cited that work as you know, rationale to revisit their audit process for how they evaluate and assess the functionality of facial recognition products. So starting in 2019, they've included as part of their audit process an evaluation or assessment of the performance of these technologies on different demographic groups. And they've been finding incredible disparities in the performance of these technologies on different demographic groups. And it also sort of opened up an interesting conversation. The reaction to our work opened up an interesting conversation about the dangers of facial recognition beyond accuracy and beyond functionality and performance. So that was something that I definitely learned the most from, which was, you know, some of the corporate reactions to our work revealed just how dangerous this technology is, even outside of functionality. So an example is IBM. In reaction to our work, attempted to sort of build the most diverse data set and, you know, collect more diverse faces in order to train a model that would perform better on Black faces. And in the process of doing that, they grabbed a bunch of images from Flickr without any level of consent to those that had uploaded those images. So that, you know, that tension between, you know, privacy and that desire for fair performance within IBM actually sparked this internal conversation around, you know, is this technology even worth it? Is what we're trying to do with this technology ever going to justify, you know, the multiple dimensions of threats and concerns related to it? And in the case of IBM, you know, by literally last summer, they concluded that no, it is not worth it, and they pulled out of the facial recognition market completely. And, you know, Microsoft made a statement that we've yet to interpret, you know, that might indicate that they might be moving out of the industry. And then Amazon, sort of feeling that public pressure a little bit, you know, put a 1-year moratorium on the police use of their facial recognition product. So this entire journey just revealed a couple things that I'll just like briefly make these 3 points that I usually make around what we're hoping to see policy-wise moving forward. So one is, you know, this challenge of disclosure, this challenge of communication around when facial recognition is being used, and, you know, how people's face data is being manipulated or handled. You know, in the cases that we currently know of people being misidentified with facial recognition and that escalating to an arrest, they almost find out by accident that facial recognition was part of that, you know, forensic process or that investigative process. You know, New York recently, City Council recently passed the POST Act, which is sort of one of the first initiatives to really force police departments, in this case, NYPD, which is one of the largest police departments in the country, to actually disclose when they're using surveillance technology, and they were incredibly, resistant to that idea of disclosure. So just the idea of disclosure and transparency around, when is facial recognition being used? If I take a picture, for my driver's license, will that face data be shared with ICE? So that kind of communication does not happen in any capacity, even with public agencies where we have a right to that knowledge. So, one thing that we're very much advocating for policy-wise is disclosure and just communication around how facial recognition is being used and how face data is being handled. The second thing that we're sort of advocating for, pushing for, is improved assessment and evaluation, understanding sort of how well these models are performing versus what the products are claiming performance to be. And this includes really questioning some of the objectives of facial recognition products. Luke, you've done a lot of great work on emotion recognition and some of the claims that are made there and really beginning to question that. Some of the great feedback that we got from the paper was Gender Shades was, how valid is that task of binary gender classification and who is harmed in the process of doing that, predicting some of these things. Using facial recognition technology in the first place, but also even outside of those facial analysis tasks, really questioning, some of these claims of performance in context of law enforcement use. So for example, the National Institute of Standards, the current evaluations will have these like nice cropped selfie type photos to evaluate the performance of these systems, and the systems get like 99% accuracy in those settings. But the way police departments are using them, and Georgetown Law has a great report on this called Garbage In, Garbage Out, where they talk about, police departments using sketch images of suspects, images of celebrities. They'll try to use like granular sort of like security camera footage and run the facial recognition model on that. So the context in which the models are actually being used, they are completely dysfunctional. So really pushing that and questioning, that audit process and that evaluation process is another sort of, and then also, of course, evaluation according to different demographic groups and performance on the groups that we're worried about. That's another sort of angle or policy discussion that we're hoping to happen. And the importance of questioning, whether or not these things work, this technology works, really plays into this idea that's kind of inherent to engineering responsibility called recall. So, if you have a car where the brakes don't work, that car is not suitable to be out in the market. And that was an important shift that actually happened in the policy conversation this summer, because before you would have these companies saying, we need to be regulated. Microsoft would release a statement, IBM would release a statement, even Amazon released a statement saying we encourage facial recognition policy. We understand that things need to be done, but the products would still be out there in the market while that conversation was happening. So I think over the summer, intersecting with the conversation around George Floyd and the need for racial equity, and really questioning the sort of institutional trust that could be had in the police. I think that really shifted the conversation away from, we need arbitrary regulation, and meanwhile, we're going to keep our product out there, to, oh, this product is, broken, and we need to pull it off of the market as we have these regulatory conversations. So that shift, that policy shift, put more of an emphasis on that second point of really thinking about functionality and thinking about how we audit these tools, so that we can know when they're just completely unsuitable for the market. And then the sort of third point is thinking about use cases for this technology and restriction according to different use cases. So, the dynamic of, the facial recognition technology used, to unlock your iPhone versus, face surveillance and police use of face surveillance are two very different use cases, two different scenarios in which facial recognition is being used and deployed. So that dynamic of, is this a technology that like is dangerous just by virtue of its development, which I think there's very valid arguments to make around, you know, if we're hoarding all this face data to train these models, the dangers inherent in that, versus, you know, the way it's being used and the way it could be weaponized. So that's definitely another sort of policy angle that gets played, is like, you know, should we be restricting the use cases involved here? So yeah, those are sort of the 3 points: disclosure, thinking about evaluation, and then thinking about the use cases of the technology and trying to restrict these in different ways or be more rigorous with respect to these in different ways. And that's really AJL's sort of mandate or mission right now, is to really develop the conversation around facial recognition to protect as many people as possible using these different strategies. So yeah, that's sort of where we are now after much strife, and the fight continues, but we've made a little bit of progress so far.
That's fantastic. And I will say, I mean, just the conversation in terms of the acceptance of regulation and the acceptance of limits on these technologies in the last 2 years has shifted so much. Yeah. I think largely because of your work and Joy's work and anchoring these conversations. And also because of the activism and work of our third speaker, who I'll introduce now and who I want to put in conversation with you, Deb. I know folks probably have many questions. Please put them in the chat. We will come to them after we hear from Tawana Petty, who is a mother, social justice organizer, youth advocate, poet, and author. She's deeply involved in causes including water rights, advocacy, data and digital privacy rights education, and racial justice and equity work. She is the national organizing director for Data for Black Lives, a movement of activists, organizers, and mathematicians committed to the mission of using data science to create concrete and measurable change in the lives of Black people. Along with Tamika Lewis, Mariela Saba, Sita Pena Gagandaran, and Kim M. Reynolds, she is the co-founder of Our Data Bodies, a research and activist collective concerned about the ways our community's digital information is collected, stored, and shared by government and by corporations. She's the former director of the Data Justice Program at the Detroit Community Technology Project, a convening member of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, an anti-racism facilitator with Detroit Equity Action Lab, a Digital Civil Society Lab Fellow at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and the director of Petty Propolis, a Black woman-led artist incubator primarily focused on cultivating visionary resistance through poetry, literacy, and literacy workshops, anti-racism facilitation, and social justice initiatives. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Spirit of Detroit Award, the University of Michigan Black Law Student Association's Justice Honoree Award, and a Certificate of Special Congressional Recognition in 2018. So Tawana, I'd love you to speak a little bit about your work in Detroit and with Our Data Bodies, and also maybe focusing on the digital defense playbook as a kind of mechanism by which communities can start to think about how technologies like facial recognition impact them and what they can do about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke, for having me, and I'm grateful to be in conversation with Deb right now. I've been on this journey towards data justice for about a decade. It started with my relationship with the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, which is a coalition of several organizations in Detroit who initially started advocating for like merely open data, just access to our information, and then moved on to privacy, equity, racial justice, and consent. And so through that work, I came into relationship with Detroit Community Technology Project as a community researcher. And through that role, we helped to co-found Our Data Bodies with across 3 cities, Detroit, LA, and Charlotte. And that research was to interrogate the ways that community members' information is shared, collected, stored, and used by governmental and law enforcement agencies. At the same time that we were starting Our Data Bodies, Detroit was ramping up a program called Project Greenlight, which is a mass surveillance program. And it started off with about six or seven surveillance cameras, which are connected to real-time crime centers in Detroit. So there are these flashing green lights that never go off, kind of like scarlet letters. So if your bedroom is outside of one of these, you're never going to get any peace. In addition to that, it's monitored by real-time crime centers, which has law enforcement officers and data analysts monitoring the footage 24 hours a day. As I indicated in 2016, it started off with 8 or 9, and they were only going to be at gas stations that stayed open late, right? And so we peaked an eyebrow, but we weren't really thinking that it was going to ramp up to the level that we are now, which is now we have over 2,000 at over 700 locations, and law enforcement has built out 2 additional real-time crime centers, spent over $30 million, and they include face recognition as a component of that. In addition to learning about that process, we also learned that law enforcement was using Stingray technology to track cell phones. We have surveillance helicopters. We have surveillance. Our city council has now approved surveillance traffic lights with license plate readers. And so there's just there are drones, of which I have the unfortunate circumstance of seeing them outside my window on a regular basis since I've been engaged in this type of social justice organizing. So when we think about the impacts that these technologies have on activists and organizers and community members, you don't have to be at a protest to be under surveillance. And so through that work, as it was ramping up, and we were also doing our research with our data bodies, we were hearing across 3 cities, Detroit, LA, and Charlotte, that that community members wanted to be seen and not watched. They felt that their information was being extracted and leveraged for the benefit of corporations and governmental institutions and law enforcement, but that they didn't have access to the same information to make livelihood. They were the smallest mistake in their lives was being replicated and integrated within systems to keep them under what we called a looping cycle of injustice. And so, you know, everything from your credit score to your face being leveraged to criminalize you. And so during that research and learning that Project Greenlight was ramping up in Detroit, we actually got some outreach from Georgetown Center for Privacy and Technology, where they asked us if we knew that face recognition was a component of Project Greenlight, of which at that time we did not. We were starting to pay attention to Project Greenlight and the way that it was rapidly expanding, but had no indication that face recognition was a part of that program. Through that conversation, we learned about Joy, Timnit, and Deb's work, and the misidentification cases, the potential for misidentification. It actually didn't take a lot of tech knowledge to know that if it's misidentifying folks and law enforcement's using it, that there'll probably be false arrest. And so we started to, I actually started to spearhead a lot of activism on the ground, getting many people engaged with protesting at the Board of Police Commissioners, which is the civilian oversight body at City Council, and pretty much at every place that would take my voice. We created magazines, we went door to door, we galvanized hundreds of residents to get involved in the struggle against face recognition and trying to get Project Greenlight out of our community. At these Board of Police Commissioner meetings, I kept saying, we're going to have a misidentification case. If we don't get rid of this, we're going to have a misidentification case. I took the research of Deb's and Joy and Timnit's. I took the research of Georgetown Center for Privacy and Technology, and we testified month after month after month. And then we had a misidentification case, the first known misidentification case in the US, which was Robert Williams. And now we've had a second, which is Michael Oliver. I want to point out Robert Williams particularly because Robert Williams does not live in Detroit. Robert Williams lives in the state of Michigan, in a suburb of Michigan. And the reason why I want to point that out is because any person who has taken a state ID or a driver's license at the Michigan Secretary of State since 1999 is in that face recognition database. So Michigan State's SNAP program, Detroit Police uses has access to that system. And so they picked this person up who doesn't live in Detroit and arrested him playing with his children, his young children at his home in the suburbs. So I want to make that clear. If you've taken an ID in 1999 in the state of Michigan, and you live in Florida, or you live in Canada now, or you live somewhere else, you could be picked up at your home where you live for something that may happen in Detroit. And I just want to let people know how wide this net has been casted. In addition to that, as Anne mentioned in her presentation, our police chief has admitted that the technology misidentifies up to 96% of the time. And their kind of fix, as Deb was kind of mentioning, like it's like purchasing a car with bad brakes and hoping that this analyst is going to somehow, and in this case, I like to use the analogy that they're going to have a mechanic sitting in the back seat, and you hope that the mechanic gets to the brakes before you crash, right? And so the law enforcement likes to use the response that, well, it's just an investigative tool. We don't only use face recognition. But they also indicated that they would only use it for violent crimes. Michael Oliver and Robert Williams were arrested, one for accused for stealing watches, and another accused for breaking and throwing a cell phone. So these folks had their lives uprooted. They were incarcerated. Michael Oliver lost his job, his home, and his vehicles, and is really trying to pick his life back up. And Robert Williams' children have been forever scarred, his young children, after seeing their father arrested. So there's a very real impact to this type of violence that's inflicted on communities using face recognition. And so we don't have the analysis that if you fix the algorithm or it's able to more properly identify, then it's going to be a better system. We know that law enforcement itself is long overdue for an overhaul, and in many cases, abolition. And so we don't think that face recognition for the use of law enforcement or governmental institutions is something that can be fixed. And then I'll finally say, through our activism, we were able to get Detroit police to report on how they use face recognition. We were able to get them to no longer use real-time surveillance with face recognition. We have been pushing for a ban, but so far those are the small wins that we've had. When they took out their contract with DataWorks Plus, they wanted to use real-time surveillance on using everything from drones, traffic lights, Project Greenlight cameras, unlimited mobile devices, which means an officer could take a mobile device home and use it and have access to these 2,000 plus cameras that are connected to schools, recreation centers, and other institutions. And then finally, I'll say, yes, we put out a digital defense playbook through our data bodies that has the voices of the community and the ways that they have been, some of the ways they've been resisting some of these systems, because we don't want to publish every way that our community members are surviving. But the digital defense playbook, I've also collaborated on a centering racial equity throughout data integration toolkit with the actionable, intelligence for social policy, and then now a technologies for liberation toolkit. And I'm happy to drop those links in the chat.
That would be awesome if you have the chance. And just to quickly say, I mean, we've had similar, I think there have been similar mixed messages from the Toronto Police Department, for instance, around claiming that they weren't using Clearview AI. Then they said, oh, we were, but we're only using facial recognition for violent crime, but then they're not. It's kind of the same story. It's like all over the place. There is a question, Tawana, in the chat about bills in the Michigan legislature that would ban facial recognition. And the questioner asks if you have any idea why these haven't moved ahead, or what some of the kind of state level politics are around bans.
Yeah, so we have been working with state legislators to impose rest in peace, State Rep Isaac Robinson. He actually died of COVID at the beginning of the crises, and he had championed legislation that would issue a 5-year moratorium on all governmental and police use of face recognition. That bill is being picked up by another state rep that we're in conversation with now, and we're hoping to try to get some room on movement on that. In addition to that, we have also consulted on federal legislation that is starting to get some more momentum under the Biden administration, and I have been part of the championing of what is called a Detroiters Bill of Rights, which is going to change the city's constitution. And one of the things that we've been able to move forward through the Detroiters Bill of Rights has been a ban on face recognition, as well as mass surveillance and demilitarizing of police, which would include those other technologies. We're facing some resistance by, of course, Detroit Police Department, the mayor and city government, but the charter commissioners who have voted in our favor are standing strong and moving straight ahead. And we hope to have that on the ballot in August. So watch out for that. And that would change the city's constitution, which means that not only would we be pushing for things like the ban on face recognition, mass surveillance, and demilitarizing of police, which means that we don't want them using military weapons on protesters, right? We're not trying to say that law enforcement can't do their job, but we think that they're responding to circumstances that they're not equipped to respond to. And because of that, they're heightening the violence that happens in our community. And so we're hoping that resources can be reallocated to those sorts of services like water affordability, affordable housing, and those sorts of mechanisms that would reduce quality of life issues and thereby reduce quality of life crime and minimize the types of systems that are being put in place in our communities when they really should be treated with equity, humanity, and resourced.
Great. I mean, and the kind of historical, the kind of genealogy of, you know, why do these police departments have these technologies? In part because of grants from the kind of post 9/11 security state, but also because of the prior kind of hysteria around the so-called war on drugs. I mean, there's a kind of this genealogy where at every point the solution is to give more money to the police departments, which is kind of a problem. Maybe. Okay, so go ahead, Deb. Yeah.
No, I had a quick comment to make around some of the challenges with like legislation and some of the frustrations I've had in participating in legislative discussions around this. I think there's something the public might not be aware of is just how present some of these companies are in policy conversations around facial recognition. Amazon made the pledge to have a moratorium on the sale of facial recognition products to police, but they are incredibly present. They're definitely still investing in the facial recognition space because they have, 2 or 3 lobbyists on every single facial recognition bill that gets put up, at the state level or even the federal level. So there's a lot of lobbying dollars, and Microsoft is also quite present in the sort of legislative effort in Washington. So there's a lot of corporate presence at these policy discussions as well, and that makes it much harder for advocates such as Tawana to be able to push for the protections that they need.
Yeah, and of course the kind of preemptive self-regulatory calls are in a way just, it can be seen as PR that then lets the kind of regulation be written with the interests of companies in mind, which is really a problem. A question from, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, my apologies. Touching and agreeing with everything Deb just said. And I also just want to lift up that Data for Black Lives is launching a No More Data Weapons campaign that we're hoping to, and the hashtag will be No More Data Weapons. And that's going to be an important campaign that folks can look out for, not only to share the different data weapons that you all are seeing in your communities, but also to see our resistance, our ongoing resistance through our organizing work.
So there was a question about the ways in which these kind of FRT systems are being, whether they're being, and how, if so, how they're being deployed in social services context, and whether either of you know anything about and building off of our first BDAM event where Virginia Eubanks was one of the speakers and talking about, other ways in which low income and marginalized people have been surveyed in other kind of algorithmic ways. So I don't know if you know if FRT is getting rolled out in those social service spaces. I know certainly in education, it's an increasing kind of problem and question.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't catch the question part of it, but yeah, I just got it. Yeah, I think so. AJL is like the Algorithmic Justice League, and I don't know, I can share a link to the website of the org. But yeah, we're thinking a lot about the different ways in which facial recognition is showing up outside of law enforcement. I think the focus on face surveillance and the use of face surveillance in law enforcement is an important starting point where law enforcement's use of facial recognition is particularly reckless and eager. And that does disproportionately affect, low-income neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. So those communities are disproportionately surveilled by police, and facial recognition is a tool to that end. But there's also all these other areas that we're seeing facial recognition show up. One being sort of the immigration context as part of ICE's sort of monitoring strategy for those that they suspect to be undocumented, or those that they flag for whatever reason. They will use facial recognition tools to pretty much monitor those people, in different ways. So, one situation that was pretty alarming in New York, I think, was a situation of, or a DMV that was, so in New York, they have policy, which was pretty much enabling undocumented immigrants to be able to, work by virtue of allowing them to get driver's licenses. So if you're undocumented, you're allowed to, get a driver's license just so that you can participate in society and perhaps even get a job. There was pressure from NYPD to get access to, that data, that face data, so that they could be able to, work with ICE to sort of track some of these people down. So it ended up becoming a safety risk for these people that are undocumented, that have this one, policy opportunity to engage in society, to then have that be weaponized against them by virtue of, their face being a tool to track them down for deportation. So that was, that's one example that comes to mind. But like you mentioned, in the education space, which is something that AJL is also looking into, is that education space of how facial recognition plays a role in not just proctoring, but also how kids are surveilled for like disciplinary action, how kids are monitored in different scenarios, and the role that face surveillance plays in sort of the educational context as well. And that does also disproportionately affect sort of these schools where they have, a very like low sort of like student to teacher ratio. So there's a lot of students for maybe one teacher. So they use these tools to sort of monitor their large volume of students, or they're these very large schools. And that will sort of disproportionately be in low income neighborhoods as well. Another thing that's also coming up more and more is worker surveillance. And it ends up sort of, I recently read an article of, McDonald's monitoring their workers for efficiency, and, some of and there's definitely factory worker surveillance that Amazon is very guilty of, where they monitor, the workers at their warehouses, and they employ a bunch of different techniques for that. That disproportionately affects low-income workers, and that kind of surveillance is definitely something that is sort of disproportionately affecting the poor.
Tawana, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Deb handled that question nicely. I think we can move on to another one.
Okay, great. So we do have a question about what options people have to discover whether police departments have facial data about them on file, what facial data they have. The questioner says in their locality that they know that the officers had cameras during protests over the summer, right? And so, what are strategies for people to actually get information about what these different police departments are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I have now learned to practice under the assumption that they have your image. As I indicated, in addition to in Detroit, in addition to your driver's license and state ID being in a system since the 90s when they were building up these databases, they use social media. They use pretty much any access to your images that they can gather. And I would also I like to lift up the Georgetown's research, and I use this term all the time. And we're living under perpetual in a perpetual lineup here in Detroit. If you walk past any camera, you can pretty much assume that they've snapped your image from that video feed. And so this is not, and to lift up my comrades with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, who are part of our data bodies, and so is Virginia Eubanks. She's a co-founder. I just like to add that. But we want to shift from power. We want to shift away from paranoia to power, right? We hold the systems accountable. It doesn't mean you tuck and hide. It doesn't mean that you don't go outside and you don't engage with your life, because one of the ways that they win is the social control. It's very difficult to not feel socially controlled, especially if you're being hyper surveilled and there are cameras and face recognition everywhere. But I think that the more that we tap into our networks, learn about the organizing efforts that are happening in other communities, the stronger we'll become. I'll finally say this. We recognize just with exactly with the disparities of like darker skin tones in face recognition, we also recognize in Detroit that we're 80+% Black city. And so it's been much harder for us to get political will to ban face recognition, because there is this the propaganda that creates the narrative that we're inherently an unsafe place to be, and that Black people need to be surveilled. And I think the research by Dr. Simone Brown and Dark Matters really helped me to understand how something like Project Greenlight, as an example, with this flashing green light that keeps our communities surveilled, ties to like the 18th century lantern laws, where you had to carry a lantern in front of your face if you weren't in the presence of a white person. And so when you can tie like the historical racism and systemic racism to these systems, and you start to think about racial equity and centering racial equity, it strengthens your resolve to fight against these systems, and tap into maybe the others. As an example, 13 or 14 other cities have been able to ban. So far, none of them have been predominantly Black. However, we've been able to learn from a lot of the organizing efforts that those organizers have done, and we're able to add that into our work so that we can then kind of struggle in a similar but different way for a city like Detroit. But I would make the assumption that they have your image.
Right. And maybe multiple groups have your image. I mean, I'll put in the chat. There was a good report from a British human rights group called Article 19, looking at the Chinese facial and especially the Chinese emotion recognition market, which is actually where a lot of emotion recognition tech is being trialed, is in education. But of course, it's also happening in the United States, and so we could use a sort of a similar report, looking at American and potentially Canadian uses too. There's a question in the chat about the intentionality of bias in these systems, and maybe Deb, you could start with this, because you've done so much work, within machine learning engineering processes to try to, find ways to fix the problems that can be fixed, right? I wonder, I mean, what is your sense in terms of intentionality versus, kind of implicit bias? If people are shipping these things knowing that there's bias within them, but not really thinking it matters, or not really thinking it cares, it just doesn't rate. I mean, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think there's sort of so I often get this question around intent, and my stance is sort of evolving into a position of I think that there can be there's multiple available explanations for why the situation is the way it is, but it's possible that none of them are acceptable. Like it's possible that regardless of intent, the by virtue of the outcomes of the situation, we can make an assessment on whether or not the situation is okay. And I think currently it's not okay. So, I have also, like you mentioned, done work with, Google, and when I was at the Partnership on AI, I also, got the opportunity to, interact with researchers at, Microsoft and some of the tech companies that we had actually audited, and, got a peek behind the hood to how they could have possibly had, that level of oversight. And I think that there's a couple sort of, implicit bias like explanations where you can talk about the fact that, some of these teams don't have a lot of diversity in the same way that, Clarifai didn't have diversity before I showed up. And, one of the reasons why they, the issue became a thing there was because I was there and I was like, my face is in here. So, that definitely plays a role in it, in the fact that these problems go undetected for a very long time because the communities building these technologies are not, in a position where they recognize immediately that discrepancy. It's something that needs to be sort of actively worked at, that attentiveness to these issues. That being said, that doesn't make it any more acceptable, the outcome of the fact that the technologies are disproportionately affecting people in this negative way and disproportionately poorly performing on specific populations. I think and this was a lot of the work that I did while working with colleagues at Google, was thinking about how do you actually get engineers to think about this as they design these tools right from the beginning of the design process throughout the model development process. How do you actually, and I think Luke, actually, you've done some work on this idea of checklisting and documentation to sort of prompt a change in engineering behavior so that it does become at the forefront of your thinking to reflect on, the ethical implications of certain decisions you're making as an engineer. So yeah, I do think that, especially early on, I'm saying sort of like 2016, 2017, before this really became like a national conversation. I do think that, and still to some degree today, this, the attitude of machine learning engineering is a very casual attitude towards some of these problems. And we're just now sort of recognizing the importance of, getting any engineer to really properly acknowledge their responsibility in the situation to think about bias and test for bias and address bias issues, but also think about some of these broader ethical challenges and consequences, some of the things Tawana has mentioned around, the validity of that problem in the first place and, the risks of creating this kind of tool in the first place. So yeah, around intent, it's very hard to say for every situation what the intent of the engineer is, but there are very sort of clear directions and paths forward around how engineers should address their responsibility and the amount of thinking they should be doing and what is acceptable and not.
Tawana, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say I've had the awesome opportunity. I'm more of a researcher by trade, but I've had the awesome opportunity to be in conversation with students who are like in masters in data analytics programs and speak to AI ethicists and data scientists and all these folks who are trying to figure out how to be ethical, not ill intent at all, no ill intent at all. However, a lot have admitted to me they just don't have the time to think about the humans behind the formulas or the numbers or the, when they're being pressured to innovate. And so, my role has been to encourage them to figure out how to have the time and to think about if you can't think about your, a whole population receiving the impact of your innovation, think about how you might receive your innovation, because there is no magic bubble that keeps ourselves and our families from being on the receiving end of those things that make it out into society. And so there has to be some kind of way to put in, if we're going to systemically change the ways that these systems are operating, those of us that do have a conscience, those of us who do care about racial equity and ethics in general, have to figure out a way to continue to think about the numbers being attached to millions of people, and what those impacts are, and have the courage to pause and redirect. And I think that that is the piece that's missing in a lot of circles that are putting new things into the market, not just in technology and data science.
And for engineers to understand that, at least for the moment, they actually have a lot of labor power, right? And that they can potentially push back against certain things because they're valuable. And I think this is, so full disclosure, I mean, I worked as a postdoc at Microsoft Research for 2 years, and I, the majority of my colleagues, had good intentions, but were pretty inchoate on structures and processes to get those intentions into reality. And on pressing against that were a whole bunch of path dependencies that, as Deb, you're saying, pushes there to be a pressure to innovate, and a kind of lack of time to think, and a lack of time to stop, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, so that's a challenge. It's a challenge, as somebody mentions in the chat. It's a capitalist challenge as well as a kind of a technical challenge.
Can I say one more really short thing?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You know how there's always this, at least my whole life that I can recall, there's been this build it, they will come. Build it, they will come. And I think and that was already harmful, but I think we've moved to build it, and if they don't come, we'll drag them along without their consent. And and I'm like, I never thought that I would get to the point where I'm begging for build it, they will come, as kind of a step back into having more conversations about consent. But yeah, I think that the consent needs to be something that's systemically wrapped into these conversations of how we engage the public. And a project called Consentful Tech Project with Una Lee and others, and the design justice work of Sasha Costanza is a really good work to follow in that regard.
Yeah, the best example of this dragging, was terrifying, is the contracting of many police services with Amazon to have Ring doorbells be kind of distributed for free in neighborhoods, right? This is the company, using law enforcement to put its surveillance devices in people's houses and saying to them, in return for promoting this, you'll get the data, which is a kind of totally wild and unholy alliance. Tawana, there's a question in the chat asking if you could tell us more about technology for liberation, which I would love to hear more about too.
Yeah, I dropped hopefully folks got the link to the toolkit. I dropped it in the chat, but technologies for liberation are like, they're kind of like these tools for abolitionist framework and thinking, right? What are the systems that we engage with that are alternative visions to the systems that are harming us? And how are we leveraging data for our benefit? How are we building out system? You could say something as simple as Anne was talking about, those technologies that obscure face recognition so that you can't, your face can't be recognized. And of course, that isn't the end all be all, because then you have law enforcement agencies. If we look at London as an example, London, England, where, they started to criminalize people who avoided these cameras, right? And so, unfortunately, as we innovate our alternative visions, they'll innovate ways to react to our alternative visions. But however, it's a constant thinking about how we can navigate and create an alternative world to the harmful systems that we're currently engaged with. And there are several examples in the Technologies for Liberation Toolkit that I dropped in the chat.
Awesome. We have a few more questions, so if y'all are willing to stick around a little bit longer, I think this is supposed to start at 8:30, but we still have almost 100 people involved, so maybe we'll take a few more questions if that's okay. Okay, so I'm looking for Bobby Rakova in the chat. Asked a question. She's working on conducting impact assessments in industry, but have hit a wall when trying to get external communities and organizations to participate in the AI impact assessment process around concrete models. What kinds of organizing frameworks do you think could help incentivize organizations in industry to cooperate with other groups such as the Algorithmic Justice League in the assessment of these processes? Maybe Deb, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, I know that the Algorithmic Justice League at this moment is sort of focused on community engagement more broadly rather than sort of institutional corporate engagement. So that might be some of the challenges. I apologize if you've reached out. You can try again. I know that, and this also speaks to sort of Sasha's, Tawana mentioned Sasha's sort of design justice framework, which obviously sort of very heavily influences the strategy at the Algorithmic Justice League, which is a very sort of community first oriented framework where there's sort of this impetus to sort of first understand the community for which your technology or your effort is meant to serve, before you can really bring in other stakeholders. So I think that might be that's very core to the strategy of AJL at this moment. So a lot of the work that's been done so far has been like community outreach work. That being said, though, I do think like the best interactions we've had so far with corporations are interactions where one, there's sort of opportunity to educate with sort of a plan for accountability or a plan for action afterwards. So there's been some interactions of, very specific contexts of, the ask is clear in terms of, what is the community perspective or what is AJL's perspective on this or AJL's assessment of this product. And in those contexts, there's also sort of this opportunity or articulation of accountability in the sense of, based off of this feedback, we will be making this specific type of decision. And then when that decision comes out, there's sort of a justification for how that feedback factored in or did not factor in. And I think those are probably the most productive, like corporate interactions that I've had personally, at AJL, but also I remember when I was at the Partnership on AI interacting with a bunch of different companies regularly. Those are sort of the best interactions I had were when things kind of moved from this very high level space into a more practical, tangible space. I think the frustration of a lot of advocacy groups, and I don't want to speak for too many people here, but I will speak to my frustration as someone working with those from advocacy groups. I think one frustration is when sometimes companies have an incentive to keep things at the conversation level because they are reluctant to take action, and they will sort of drag the conversation because it means just more time before they're pushed into a particular direction or towards a particular action. And that is a very frustrating place to be if you're like a low resourced advocacy group. Like there are other mechanisms you will turn to before you end up in another committee meeting that will lead to another committee meeting as like a stall tactic. So I do know that there's concern around that, and I think impact assessments are a very nebulous sort of artifact in the sense that they can mean many different things. So the more precise you can be about exactly what you mean, the easier it is to engage. And like I mentioned, if there's some level of accountability mechanism afterwards, of like, we will give you a report of like how we took your feedback and we will explain to you, the action that we took afterwards, just some mechanism of accountability. If that's not clearly stated, it's very difficult to justify the engagement.
Tawana, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's frustrating having to engage. It definitely is a contradiction, and I similar to Deb, as someone who's, well, I can't even say on the ground these days. It's mostly on the Zoom, but as someone who's engaged in charter revision commission meetings, city council meetings, board of police commissioner meetings, a lot of times you do know you're going in there to be gaslit, right? And what I've learned to do, I've learned to be speaking to the public, the other general public who is in that space that doesn't have the information. And so if they're only going to get the other side of things, the side that wants these technologies and systems to continue forward, then they're gonna champion things that are destructive and harmful. And so I've learned to use a lot of those spaces as political education spaces to bring in resources and information. And it's kind of how we've had a groundswell in resistance to get to the point where we have about 500 organizations who've signed on to like the Detroiters Bill of Rights. We have folks who were shouting us down at first, particularly elders who were shouting us down when we were saying get rid of face recognition. And they were like, what are you talking about? That's great. The police told us that it's going to make us safe. And our repeat attendance at those spaces and bringing in the research and bringing in new information shined a light on how the misconceptions of the ways these technologies can even be used for safety, and the cost benefit analysis, the harms, the misidentifications, thanks to all the brilliant research. And so, yeah, I find myself in a lot of spaces where I have to take some time to myself after I leave and and regroup emotionally. But I'm learning that they're not the only audience.
That this conversation actually kind of partially answers and touches on another question from earlier in the chat. In the George Floyd uprising, military weapons and surveillance tech were employed by the DHS in ways that are still under investigation by a congressional committee, showing how military-grade tech is turned inward domestically. What else beyond policy can we do to prevent this norm of extra-legal surveillance tech that we can't even decipher? How do we challenge this capacity for local jurisdiction to be bypassed by federal intervention? And I would add, or the kind of just ignoring directives and laws from one branch of government or one area of government, being ignored by another. There's an example in Canada is, so Canada has an algorithmic impact assessment directive in its federal government. And there was a story in the Globe and Mail, our big paper up here, that said the Department of National Defense is just ignoring it. They're not doing anything with it. So if either of you have other sort of tactical thoughts about how to, how to work the layers of government to create this change, this good change, as opposed to being kind of stonewalled by them.
I have some strategies from the facial recognition fight. So in actionable auditing, we mentioned a little bit the early frustration in audit studies of online platforms and the HCI space that Gender Shades and other sort of algorithmic audits are based off of, and the kind of frustration in that space at the time around getting companies to do anything in reaction. So the reason we named the paper Actionable Audit was how do we actually design an audit that gets these companies to take action, to actually respond to the audit that we do. And we found that there are some characteristics of Gender Shades that made it effective at doing that. One is this bulletproof method of public pressure, in the sense of if you name multiple well-known recognizable targets and you sort of pit them against each other, which is a strategy that's been used in the past in financial auditing, then the press is interested in that and the public gets really mad, and the public angst around that pressures local, state, federal governments to take action. So that sort of collective power of stirring up the public to care about some of these issues and articulating it to the public. Something I really appreciate about working with Joy is that she is someone that is so cautious around communication. She puts in a lot of energy to make sure that things are very sort of presentable and digestible, and it pays off in the sense that people really resonate with the work that she puts out. So I think that understanding the value of that communication to the public in order to really encourage them to participate in the fight is an essential element of audit work in order to actually get to accountability or get to a positive response. The other thing I'm going to say, we also did another thing which some people don't always know about, which is a strategy that we had pulled from the information security space, which is they have a really sort of established method of communicating to companies as well, where they have a strategy. It's called a coordinated bias disclosure, sort of a riff off of their coordinated vulnerability disclosure. But if they find that there's a bug in a software system, they have a pretty detailed procedure as to how you communicate that to the company and then to the public in a way that sort of corners the company to have to take action before it's released to the public, or to at least release a statement on how they're going to take action before it's released to the public. And one, it like prevents lawsuits, which is great. And then the sort of second thing is that it does push them to act within a particular time frame before it's released to the public, and that does kind of push them a little bit to take action. But outside of like relying on like corporate self-governance, which I am convinced will not be the answer to anything. I like ACLU's strategy with facial recognition. So their facial recognition campaign strategy has been to actually get bans happening at the municipal level. So they will, literally, lobby, city councilors, at Berkeley, at San Francisco, and then get enough sort of buy-in from a municipal government to get, a local mandate banning facial recognition. And then once they kind of have enough local mandates, then they'll have the leverage to sort of bring it up at the state level. And then if they have enough states, in this case, they have San Francisco and they have Massachusetts, where it's, discussions where there's enough sort of local mandates to bring it up at the state level, then they can actually bring that up to the federal level. So that very sort of like grassroots method of, and Fight for the Future also has a similar strategy as well, where they'll go to like, different campuses and use that to leverage for local politics and use that to leverage for higher things. So I think that sort of grassroots method has also been really effective and is really cool to see. Oh, sorry. I also have like one other small point, which is you had made a point earlier, Luke, around how sometimes people have like good intentions, but they lack sort of the resources to be able to like translate that into action towards those good intentions. I think that also very much happens in the policy space as well. Mm-hmm. There are people that understand that they don't want facial recognition, or they're worried about facial recognition, but they have no idea, which policy directions or which policy strategies, some of the things I had mentioned around like disclosure, restriction, all of those things they don't get. So something that ACLU also did that really helped was they actually provided like template policies that, municipalities could just really take that and be like, okay, we can't do this and we can do this, and rework the template to fit their situation and run with that. And that really helped them scale bans as well at the local level. So I think, resourcing, different types of stakeholders is definitely essential here.
And things like model bills in a similar way, legislation. Yeah. Tawana, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I'll say, as I indicated, Detroit has been a special case. We've been in collaboration with ACLU, and thanks to Fight for the Future, who's had our back since day one, and trying to do the community input over government surveillance ordinance here. It's kind of been stuck for 2 years, going back and forth between ACLU and City Council. But what we did is, when we didn't win the ban here, we went on to try to get the Board of Police Commissioners to intervene. When they didn't intervene, we tried to get City Council to intervene. When they didn't intervene, we then found the city officials who did flip and join our side. And that's how we came up with the Detroiters Bill of Rights. And we said, we're going to tackle the city's constitution, and then we're going to roll in that community input over government surveillance ordinance into the city's constitution. And so it really does take a lot of perseverance, a lot of coalition building across state lines, and sometimes across country lines, because all of these platforms have been tremendously important for keeping our struggle in the forefront. And as Deb was mentioning, it is kind of getting city officials to kind of bicker with each other, right, about these issues, because several of the ones who have signed on to our Detroiters Bill of Rights voted for these technologies, voted to fund them, were champions of them. But because of our persistence and bringing the research and constantly outreaching and discovering who were the folks who we thought we could change their hearts and minds, now they're champions for us. And so, but that took us almost 3 years. And so, and we're still going, and we still have an uphill battle. And then getting law enforcement agencies to speak publicly about the systems that they're using, because we sent so much media to question them and to interrogate them about the uses. We got the chief to publicly say that it's 96% inaccurate, and so forcing them to have some level of transparency, even if it's not in their policy, is also a kind of a winning strategy. And so, yeah, like I said, we're able to now we get the face recognition reports are released every week. We have a general sense of how they're using face recognition. We know that they're using it 100% on Black people in Detroit. They've not used it on any other racial demographic. And so those are every time we get new information from them, we increase our strategy and it becomes part of our policy advocacy. And so, yeah, so you have to find those legislators that you can, I mean, trust is a loose word, but the ones who you can get to lean in your direction, and have them leverage their political will and their resources to support the struggle.
So, I mean, I always tell my students the thing that you can do well. One of the you can both engage in grassroots activism, and you can also find and support politicians who understand these issues and will vote on the right side for them, right? And and a lot of them now are maybe more savvy and more on the right side than they used to be. There's a question in the Q&A about how to protect activists within the corporate world from challenges. Yeah, I see the one that's shaking her head, and of course the firing of Meg Mitchell and Tunde Jebru is on everybody's mind in this space right now. So if you have any thoughts or about just in general about how to successfully be a corporate activist in this context. You don't have to dive in on specific matters, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think the specific example is sort of an important one to talk about, just because of how influential those researchers were, like not just personally impactful, which they definitely both were, personally impactful to me and my growth and development in this space, but also just, I've spent years at this point, watching just how much energy they've put into the field and the conversation around, ethics in the AI space, but also the role of companies and corporations in terms of pushing that forward. So I worked with both Timnit and Meg on model cards, and Meg spent about a year of just, constant pushing to be able to implement model cards within Google as part of, a requirement for them to document some really important details that they were not documenting before, as part of all their cloud models. And that took a lot of work, a lot of energy. I'm still sort of shocked at how they were treated towards the end, just given how much of a contribution that they made through their work. But she is the one that has convinced me, by virtue of one, just the health of their team. So I think these two women did a great job building a very diverse team that kind of was ironically within this very hostile company, corporate space, the safe space for a lot of diverse researchers in the space. And I think that was a really important thing that they did. But almost as a side effect of having that diverse team, but also coming in with sort of their own perspectives, they were able to really change a lot of things about how engineering at Google worked. So, they were able to implement a lot of important interventions that are probably still in place today, that have like sort of fundamentally changed the engineering process at Google. For reference, there's like Google AI and Google Engineering, and Google AI is, the group that does research, but they actually also build machine learning products. And research is a very messy space where people are not very careful around documentation. They're not very careful around data provenance. They don't do a good job recording sort of algorithmic development and decision making. But these Google AI models will actually be what they'll try to integrate into products. So you had these researchers that thought they were just playing around with toy data sets and building models that would end up integrated into products that would be affecting billions of people. And it was really Meg's team, Megan Timnit's team, that was able to be like, wait, hold up, there's accountability required here, there's responsibility required here. So I do think that there is a role for corporate research or corporate researchers to play. But I think with Timnit and Meg's sort of critique of large language models, which is a Google product, it revealed the fact that that role is limited. There's certain things that they could do, and even the stuff that they could do, like model cards, which I see as it's an intervention that should be simple to implement, but it took over a year to get out. So even the simple interventions were a huge challenge to do internally. But yeah, there was definitely a limit where once their recommendations contradicted the bottom line of Google, and that conflict became very evident, then suddenly the company's tone changed drastically, and we saw it escalate to them both getting fired sort of dramatically and unfairly. And I think that's something that really struck me about the situation was I've worked with that team on facial recognition, and Google does not sell facial recognition products. So Google was very supportive of that work and being very critical of facial recognition because they weren't in that market. And compared to, when they actually were making very valid critiques about language models, and Google was hoping to deploy a language model within the year, and suddenly that conflict became clear. So yeah, incredibly disappointed in the way that played out. But I think it speaks to just how vulnerable those that are in this critical space, how vulnerable we all are in terms of, once you actually contradict that bottom line and that profit motive, suddenly the company can just decide to pretty much strip itself of its ethics. Yeah.
Tawana?
Yeah, I'd also just like to say, and Deb says this as well, the argument that folks just shouldn't be in those corporate spaces is not helpful. We benefited tremendously from having them in those spaces. Folks on the ground doing social justice organizing. And so it's frightening for their teams that they left behind. It's frightening for them and their futures and careers that they've built, and just the heightened level of scrutiny and surveillance that I can only imagine that they're under because of what has happened. And so, I'd ask that we lift them up, and I'm sure there's no shortage of career offers, but that misses the point, right? It misses the point entirely. And so, I think that us continuing to support the folks who are brave enough to go into the bellies of the beast and do this systemic organizing that needs to happen contemporaneously with the on the ground activism and organizing is going to be important if we're going to continue to have people brave enough to go into those spaces and do that work.
Yep. Maybe, I know it's now 9 o'clock. I think we should be wrapping up soon, but there's one last question in the Q&A, which is what are the alternatives to surveillance facial recognition that can be implemented in the criminal justice system to ameliorate the bias against and overrepresentation of lower class and racialized communities? And Tawana, I'm going to take that as a setup for you to talk about abolition, if you want to talk about abolition, because I think that's the alternative, and I'd love you to speak more about that.
It's so hard for folks to hear abolition. I come from, full transparency for anybody who knows me, I come from a family of law enforcement, right? And we have to have this conversation quite frequently. And I tell them every day, stop thinking about me putting you out of work. Think about the fact that you should want to wake up and not have to capture people for a living, right? Think about a society where quality of life issues are removed or reduced so that quality of life crimes are not a thing, so that folks aren't looking at full storage facilities full of food while they starve and then criminalized because they go into that storage facility to get food. Any living being If we just want to think of any species on the earth that's hungry is going to pursue food before they die. You know, I mean, it's a common reaction to being in extreme poverty. And so, yeah, not all crimes are related to poverty, but many are. Many are because of disinvestment, abandonment, neglect, racial inequity. And so we have to be thinking about how to make these systems more racially equitable, and move beyond policing as the first line of defense, restore the village mentality, return to our respect for the earth and each other. And as we learned through our research and talking to community members across 3 cities, it is wanting to see each other, not watching each other. Stop joining apps so you can report on your neighbors, and creating these algorithms that target communities that don't look like you. I'd much rather us create a culture where if there's an elder on your street who doesn't have water, you try to ensure they have water. Or if there's a young person who's walking to school by themselves, you make sure they get to the school bus or they get to school. You watch them from your windows or your front porches. And so I'll finally say we have a campaign in Detroit called Green Chairs, Not Green Lights. And that is our alternative vision to Project Greenlight. And it's really the young people went door to door, even through the pandemic, making sure that the elders had food and resources, making sure they were able to stay in contact with one another. They helped them create these little pod maps where they could think of like 4 or 5 people they could call in case of an emergency. And just kind of returning to this notion of ensuring that we have things we need, so that we can take care of one another. And when you do that, you reduce the needs for policing and surveillance and militarization in your communities. And you really, if you look, it really is mostly like predominantly Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, Muslim communities, that it seems to be that is the only imagination that we can seem to muster in how we're take care of those communities. But if I go 15 minutes outside of my city, I don't see green flashing lights where the community is predominantly white. I don't see all of these I don't see police officers patrolling every street. I don't see surveillance drones and surveillance helicopters. And so I just want us to have the type of imagination that we have in the communities that we've created safety, that other communities have created safety, and have that same vision for the communities that are not predominantly white. It really doesn't take a lot of imagination. We all want to be safe, and surveillance is not safety.
I think there's a possibly better way to finish than that. So Tawana, Petty, Devaraji, thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. It's been such a pleasure and an honor. Yeah, thank you for your insights and for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I know that the other BDAM organizers do too. And thank all of you who are still here, 68 people still on the chat, for attending this event. Please do register now if you're interested for the 3rd BDAM event in March. Details are available on our website. And thanks. And I get to see these folks again tomorrow, so I'm really excited about that. But for everybody else, have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.